What do you think about the legality of the environmental applications from Queensland Gas?
Okay, I've had a look at the application, and what is of concern are the manufacturer safety data sheets, or the material safety data sheets they include. They are certainly not to the Australian standard, and as such they are in breach of both the Queensland Act and the National Code for material safety data sheets.
So they're not meeting the obligations under the Act?
No, under the Act, the obligation is to have a material safety data sheet with 16 parts, which gives full information, provides emergency contacts for Australia. None of these things are included in those MSDSs.
What does it say to you?
It says to me that the company has been very lazy in its production of that environmental authority. It says to me that the department is not carrying out a proper oversight role. That should have been picked up before that document was ever released. And it's worrying because if they're being lazy about those sort of details, what other details are we not seeing?
So tell me the importance of that to people watching this. They may go, oh, they're just safety data sheets. Just bring it home to why this is so crucial that they meet the obligations under the Act.
A material safety data sheet is basically your consolidated information on how dangerous a chemical is, how it must be managed, how it must be handled, and how the waste must be dealt with. If you don't have that information, then you can't actually manage those industrial chemicals appropriately. And from the ones I saw in the Environmental Authority, they did not provide the type of data that would allow a worker or a company to really manage that chemical safely and taking in all of its environmental responsibilities. And in a way, reading that document, it looks as if there's a serious attempt to downplay the risks of these chemicals. And I've got to say, the chemicals used in the fracturing process presented by the document are a serious bunch of chemicals. They're not soft in any manner.
So what should be on those safety data sheets, in your view?
MSDS, a safety data sheet, according to the Australian standard, should have 16 different parts, and it should cover everything from the emergency warnings and the emergency contacts through to full human toxicology data on human health. It needs to have data on environmental fate and environmental toxicology. It needs data on handling, how to manage the chemical, how to handle it, and very importantly, what happens at the end in the waste phase. It also requires data on the regulatory requirements for Australia, if there are any standards like how much a worker is allowed to breathe, so a standard for air. It must include all of those Australian-specific regulatory standards and information, and unfortunately these ones didn't.
I think the most alarming thing, for people watching this is that there's just not enough data for what happens to the potential impacts on health and environment, is there? I mean, isn't that the bigger issue here? And how crucial is that? And that they're left out.
Material safety data sheets, no matter how comprehensive they are, can't tell you everything, particularly if the studies and the tests have not been done. And certainly for the vast majority of these chemicals, we do not have a full data set. We don't know how they affect reproductive health. We don't know if they're carcinogens. We certainly don't have information on their environmental fate or how they affect organisms in the environment. What is also worrying is a number of these chemicals don't even have CAS numbers. And to explain that, if you have a CAS number, you then have a way of tracking that chemical and tracking studies on that chemical. When you don't have a CAS number, you don't even really know what chemical you're dealing with. So some chemicals couldn't even identify. Those we could identify certainly did not have comprehensive data on them. And I suppose to bring that home, of the 23 most commonly used compounds in fracturing fluids, the national regulator, NICNAS, has only assessed 2 of those 23. And of the 2 that they have assessed, they weren't assessed for their use in fracturing fluids. So you can basically say of the 23 major chemicals used in this process, they have not been assessed by any national regulator.
Is it reckless?
we would call it reckless from an environmental and a human health issue. Yes, of course it is reckless. Unfortunately, when we look at chemicals in Australia, industrial chemicals in Australia, the vast majority of chemicals that industry use are not and have never been assessed, which is a major worry. But the difference with fracturing fluids is that you're basically releasing them to the environment. You're sending them out. I think I saw an estimation for one well. It's about 18,000 kilograms of fracturing fluids added in the fracturing process, and of that, only up to 40% can be reclaimed. So you're left with anything up to 7,000 kilograms of these chemicals remaining in the structure of the earth when the process is finished. And when we don't know much about them, when we don't know their effects and we don't know their environmental fate, I would call that reckless, yes.
The coal seam gas companies, their lobby groups, APIA, the line is it's safe, there's nothing to worry about. I mean, what do you think of that?
Well, I certainly wouldn't be trusting companies to tell me the truth about chemicals, even if they actually knew. And I can't see how anyone can claim that they are safe when we don't have the data on their environmental and human health effects or the data on their environmental fate. So a claim to trust me that everything's okay and everything is safe is pretty much a worthless claim.
So these commonly found chemicals, we don't know about them. They're not even regulated. They're not even notified. Is that?
That's basically the case. They're on the Australian Index of Chemical Substance, which is just simply a list of chemicals used in Australia. They have never been assessed. The regulator has got no data on their human health or their effects on the environment or how they are used. The two chemicals that were assessed because there was concerns over their toxicity, but in a totally different type of use. So now that we know these chemicals are being used in fracturing fluids, under the Act, the company should have approached the national regulator for a secondary notification assessment. And all that basically means is the company should have told our regulator, NICNAS, that we are now using these chemicals in fracturing fluid, which is totally different to how they've been used before. And then they should have been completely reassessed for that usage. But that's just the two that have any assessment. The other 21 have no assessment whatsoever.
So we don't know a thing about these other chemicals?
We know only what we can glean from the scientific literature, if there's been any research, what the companies are willing to tell us. But basically we do not have a whole picture on how the chemicals function, their effects, and how they're used, and most importantly, how they're disposed of.
How alarming is that for you as a regulator, someone that's worked in chemical management, for 25 years?
It is extremely alarming because these chemicals are not being used in the closed confine of a factory, which would be worrying enough. They're not only exposing workers, but they are being released to the environment. You can't bring them back. As we've heard, up to 40% of the chemicals they use will remain within the structure of the seam and can move through the groundwater. This is of major concern, and certainly my personal opinion is that we need a moratorium on fracturing chemicals until a complete assessment has been undertaken by our national regulator.
From what you know of the chemicals that are being used, what do you think is at stake here? What's at risk?
I think there's risks to the workers certainly. What we've seen in the difference between the material safety data sheets that we've been given in the authorities and the ones that we've been able to take off some of the better websites like ChemWatch. These are serious worker risks. Many of them are sensitisers. That means that they can affect the skin. You can get allergies and reactions that will never go away. They are chemicals that affect the lung and the ability to breathe. They are chemicals that affect reproductive toxicity. So a number of them are associated with spontaneous abortions. So there's a whole lot of risks related to workers and to people that come in contact with them. The problem about releasing chemicals to the environment when we know so little about them and so little about their environmental fate or effects is that they can do their dangerous business. They can affect living organisms in water, in air, in soil. And we don't know what we're looking for because we don't know anything about the chemical originally. Some of them that I have looked at certainly are already ringing alarm bells for me when it comes to the environmental safety. There are a number of chemicals that look like they could be short-chain chlorinated paraffins, which are chemicals that have even come to the notice of the UN, and a scientific committee of the UN has found that they're persistent, bioaccumulative and toxic. So these chemicals could be bioaccumulating in organic life out there. We don't know. For example, most of the chemicals have no data on how they affect invertebrates, water invertebrates. So are they affecting the minute life at the bottom of the food chain when it comes to, aquatic environments? There's so much we don't know that it is really hard to assess what is actually happening to them and what they are actually affecting.
One of the issues in Queensland is a lot of those bores, those aquifers are being sourced by bores used for cattle. Feedstock, etc. Yeah. What do you see as the potential problem there? There's a direct route into the food chain, isn't it?
If these chemicals are getting into the groundwater and flowing freely outside of the coal seam, then yes, there is of major concern to anyone using that water. And that's not only the cattle, it's the wildlife, it's the people that eat the cattle. It really starts to see a long process of food chain contamination, which we would be worried about.
And over a period of this industry, they say at least 20 to 30 years, 40,000 wells in Queensland. What are your chances of that happening, do you think?
I think the chances are very large. When you look at how much is left, multiply that by the 40,000 wells, multiply that by 20 years, and you have got a significant contamination issue of the environment.